In the mid-1950s, Victorian George Bailey was Australia's fastest motocross rider, or scrambler as it was called in those days. Bailey from Frankston became our country's first true Australian motocross champion, winning 5 Australian championships in 1956 and 1957. Although 2 championships were held earlier in Victoria and South Australia, with Ken Rumble winning 5 titles, the 1956 championship at Moorebank in New South Wales were the first to have official teams from all states. George competed in every class that year, winning the 125, 250 and 500cc national titles. During 1956, George held 12 national and state titles in all classes across Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia and Queensland. What set him apart from the rest was his incredible expertise and mechanical craftsmanship. Not only did he prepare and maintain his own bikes, George designed and built his own engines and made innovative modifications to his street bikes to suit motocross conditions. Later on, these breakthrough changes proved that George was way ahead of his time. George Bailey was born on the 24th of August 1929 at the Maxwellton Hospital in Frankston, Victoria. He had an older brother, Charlie, and 2 sisters, Gwen and Isabel, and grew up on his father's native nursery farm. It was here George learned how to maintain the farm machinery, which proved to have a great influence on his success in later years. George attended schools in Langwarrin and Frankston, but he was never fond of school and wagged classes quite a bit. He was a typical country kid who loved tinkering with engines and only spent a year at high school, leaving to work on a poultry farm. George first developed an interest in motorbikes when he was about 10, when his brother Charlie brought home his first bike. At age 14, George purchased his own bike from money he saved selling rabbit skins and chopping firewood. His mum wasn't supportive, so his dad told him to hide the bike in the shed until she got used to the idea. At 17 in 1946, George started racing scrambles and was a foundation member of the Frankston District Motorcycle Club, which his brother Charlie actually founded that year. In 1952, when he was 23, George had a serious and near-fatal crash when his motorbike hit the side pillar of a car head-on. The policemen and ambulance staff thought he was dead, with George overhearing their conversations while lying motionless on the side of the road. George badly fractured his skull and spent 6 weeks recovering in hospital. But his love of bikes never faded, and as soon as he was better, he set about rebuilding the damaged AJS bike. Before long, George was racing scrambles again, and on the 25th of August 1952, in his second ride after recovering from his road accident, he placed 5 times, winning 2 events at the Box Hill Open Scramble in Springvale. George first met his wife-to-be Glad Taylor in 1952 at a local charity scramble championship at Langwarrin, just after his serious road accident. George won 4 classes at Langwarrin, including the prestigious All Powers class. Glad presented the winners trophies and after the event asked his friend for a ride on the back of his motorbike. He declined, but George's father overheard the conversation and prompted George to take up the offer, which he did. After 1 lap around the track at a fair pace, Glad was excited and asked to do another lap, and the rest is history. Glad felt that George was attracted to her, as she too loved motorbikes, and together they would talk for hours at a time about bikes and the sport. The loving couple were married a year later on the 22nd of August 1953 at the Frankston Presbyterian Church, with a local policeman escorting the bridal car through the streets. The Frankston Motorcycle Club members formed a guard of honour, with crash bars forming an arch as they came down the church steps. Together, George and Glad produced 4 children: Robin, Karen, Andrew and Amanda, with the boys sharing their father's love of motorcycles. George and Glad also became successful business partners throughout their lives in Victoria and Queensland. George Bailey started racing scrambles in 1946 at age 17 and continued until he was 30. He was naturally fit, riding a horse or push bike while going to school. And when George started racing, he would practice at the army camp and then later on his home track on the weekends. At times, he also bashed a tyre with a sledgehammer or chopped wood to condition his body for racing. In 1953, George competed in all the local scrambles, including events at Springvale, Ravenswood, Langwarrin and Point Henry. It was at Point Henry where George won his first state Victorian Championship the following year, winning the all-powers class on a 500cc matchless. From here on, George placed at nearly every local state or national scramble that he competed in. One of his greatest victories was on the 27th of February 1955, when he won the Victorian 250cc Championship at Springvale. All-time great Keith Stacker pushed George the whole way, and it was a very special day with a huge crowd of over 5,000 people due to world champion road racer Jeff Duke entering for the event. Duke was touring Australia and agreed to race motocross at this event to give it more publicity. He had cut his teeth racing scrambles in England and represented his country in the Motocross of Nations. But he had not ridden for a long time, so it was very sporting of him to agree to ride. Part of the prize money for the 1955 Victorian Championship was a canteen of cutlery and £50, the same amount that it cost George to build his 250 engine. Scrambles in Victoria had a huge following during the late 1950s, and because of the intense rivalry between 3 of the top riders, namely Bailey, Ken Rumble and Les Sheehan, a special match race was organised between the trio. At that event, at the Cranbourne Racecourse, the 3 champions were so evenly matched they each won a race. After winning state titles in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, George was now ready for the national championships. The 1956 Australian Scrambles Championships at Moorebank near Sydney in New South Wales would be the first time that George competed with the nation's top riders. These were the first true championships of national status, with official state teams from Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales entered, much to George and Glad's surprise at the time. These championships were also the first ever televised outside broadcast sports event for Channel 9, so the course was doubled in length with a lot of sand shipped in. The sandy circuit favoured the WA riders, so the last thing everyone expected was for one rider to all but dominate the event, but George did. He competed in all 5 classes and won 3 in his first attempt, winning the Australian 125cc class on a Triumph Terrier, the 250cc class on the Bailey Special and the 500cc class on a Matchless. WA riders Peter Nicol and Charlie West won the 350cc and Unlimited titles respectively, with both riding BSA machines. Bailey was a quality mechanic and maintained his own machines. He actually designed and built the 250cc Bailey Special using AJS and matchless parts. With encouragement from his brother, George decided to defend his national titles at the 1957 Australian Championships in Amberley, Queensland. He successfully defended his 250cc title and won the prestigious Unlimited All-Powers class on a 500cc Triumph Tiger 100 engine in a matchless frame, taking his tally of national championships to 5, equalling Ken Rumble's record. Due to work commitments, the costs and time to travel to Tasmania for the 1958 Australian titles, George did not compete that year, nor any more national titles. At the time, he and his brother ran an RACV roadside breakdown service and were on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. George was never that keen on going interstate. He just enjoyed racing for the fun of it. During his racing career, George Bailey designed and built 2 of his own engines, winning several Australian and state championships on these machines, the Bailey 250 Special and the Triumph 500 Twin. George won the 1955 250cc Victorian Championship on a motor he designed and built using his 1948 350cc AJS, converted to a 250cc. The first Bailey 250 engine, which was in the 350cc rigid AJS frame, had these features: flywheels that were machined and reduced in weight, a 500 conrod with a specially made up crank pin, a ported and modified head, modified push rods and springs to increase the rev range, through studs from head to crankcases to take the extra stress of high compression, ground and highly polished rocker assemblies, a TT Racing carby and special cams imported from England were fitted, and the engine was run on methanol. The following year, in 1956, George won his second Victorian Championship with this engine and his first Australian 250cc Championship at Moorebank in New South Wales. It is believed that this was the engine that expired while George was leading the 350cc Championship at Moorebank, so George built a stronger, better and faster engine, the No. 2 Bailey 250 Special. To make the 350cc engine into a 250, George retained the 350 barrel, bore size and piston, but needed to reduce the stroke size. To do this in No. 2 Bailey 250 Special, he altered the crank pin position in the flywheels and used a stronger Vanguard car conrod. This meant that the engine was over square, with a wider bore than the length of the stroke. At the time, many people doubted that this design would work. Not only did it work, it was fast and the first of its type to win a national title in Australia and possibly across the world. George won the 1956 South Australian State Motocross Championship on the new Bailey 250 Special at Shido Park, then retained his 250 Australian crown on it at Amberley in Queensland on the 14th of July 1957. With 3 Australian championships under his belt, people laughed when George rolled out a 500cc Triumph twin engine, which he finished building in mid-1957. It is believed to be the first twin-cylinder scrambler hybrid using a twin-cylinder Triumph engine placed in a better handling matchless frame. This was groundbreaking at the time, and the skeptics claimed it would not work, stating that the big twin would be too powerful to handle, but George proved them wrong. He unveiled the new bike at a local Victorian scramble where 2 of the country's top riders were competing, John Burrows and Ray Fisher. George was ridiculed on the day, with the laughing commentators drawing the crowd's attention to the bike at the start of the first all-powers race for the day. Burrows and Fisher led early and got the shock of their lives when George sailed past them to win the race. He took this machine to the Australian Championships later that year in Queensland and won his 5th national title on it. He also won the Grand National at Clarkfield in Victoria on it in October 1958. Later on, the English built Rickman Matisse motocross bikes that had twin-cylinder engines, achieving world-renowned success. George was possibly the first person to do this, proving to be very innovative and resourceful throughout his career and lifetime. Before the triumph, George also won an Australian All-Powers Championship on a 500cc matchless at Moorebank in 1956. Although this was mostly a standard engine, George made significant changes to the street machine to modify it for scrambles. Although George never contested any more Australian Championships after 1956, he still competed locally. At the time, Charlie and his brother George ran their own motorcycle repair shop in a shed behind Charlie's home in Beach Street, Frankston. Then in 1956, the brothers established a mobile garage and towing firm in the same street on the corner of Beach Street and McMohon's Road. They also had the RAC Victoria motor vehicle breakdown contract for the Mornington Peninsula and were on call 24/7 for 5 years, except for the days he was racing, which contributed to his health breakdown in 1959. Under the name of Bailey Motors and Motorcycles, they established a small motorcycle shop repairing and servicing motorcycles, including PMG and police bikes. As it turned out, George's 1958 Grand National win at Clarkfield in Victoria on the Triumph Twin turned out to be his last race. Unfortunately, he became sick later that year, which developed into severe double pneumonia and rheumatic fever, and the need for long hospital treatment in 1959. Sadly, this ended his racing career at 30 years of age. After recovering from his illness, George focused on business and was offered the Honda agency in the mid-1960s, establishing the Bailey Motorcycle Centre in Young Street in 1968. By then, they had the agencies for all the popular brands of motorcycle and became Victoria's top Honda dealer for 3 successive years in the early 1970s, winning several trips to Japan to tour the Honda factories. The highlight of these trips for George was when he was able to take Glad, as well as meeting Mr. Honda. During this time, George turned his attention to his children and other young motorcyclists. To provide the local teenagers with a venue and guidance for their motorcycling activities, in 1969 George and Glad started the Frankston Sub-Junior Motorcycle Club. The Junior Club combined with the Senior Frankston Motorcycle Club that still exists today and produced some great riders and identities including Mike Landman, Gary Benn, Anton Ehlers and the Bailey boys, Robin and Andrew. Even daughters Karen and Amanda rode motocross, riding in the Bill Patterson Cheney mini bike rallies in the early 70s before they developed other interests. At the 1973 Victorian Short Circuit Championships held at Seymour, Andrew won the Sub-Junior Championship and Robin was second in the A-grade 125cc Championship aboard Honda Elsinore machines. Robin was also third in the Victorian 125 motocross titles that year on the same machine. In 1974, Robin was third in the Victorian 125 Motocross Championships held over 6 rounds, winning the last race at Wallen on the same 125 Honda. To avoid ending up in a wheelchair due to his arthritis, George's doctors advised him to go to a warmer climate. So in 1975, the family moved to North Deep Creek in Gympie in Queensland, except for elder son Robin, who took over the family business, and Karen, who was by then married with her first child. Robin sold the shop in 1977, taking a holiday sailing across the South Pacific. Then he moved to Queensland permanently with his fiancée Colleen, starting their own family in 1981. During this time, George and Glad started an Angora goat stud in North Deep Creek in Gympie, and it thrived for many years. To supplement their income, George also performed farm machinery and bike maintenance and repair work, and they grew carnations in greenhouse tunnels. In 1975, George helped his son Andrew pursue his motocross career until his farm commitments became too demanding. Then the following year, when he became real serious about the sport, Andrew moved to Brisbane to work and base himself for racing, and he's still there today. Andrew Bailey became a top national motocross rider in a career that spanned 10 years, starting in mini bikes, then progressing to a professional full-time racer, one of the first Australians to achieve this in the late 1970s. He won and placed in multiple state Victorian, New South Wales, Queensland and Australian Motocross Championships, as well as short circuit titles. Andrew's father George was instrumental in his early racing days, hotting up his SL70 and Mini Trail for the mini bike rallies, which in 1972 were held at Wallen and attracted huge rider entries. Then in 1973, George tuned a Honda SL100 that enabled Andrew to be competitive when he moved up into the sub-junior ranks for 14 to 16-year-olds before the Honda CR125 bikes hit the showroom floors. When the CR came out, George specifically coached Andrew for short-circuit racing, and he won the Victorian sub-junior titles on this bike in 1973 at Seymour after a hard-fought battle with Ron Dinsdale. Andrew rode the CR Honda again in 1974 at Ngambie, coming second this year to Dinsdale in the Victorian sub-junior motocross titles and the Junior Grand National at Christmas Hills. When Andrew was 16, the family moved to Queensland and he took on an apprenticeship with Gympie Honda, who received stock from the Queensland Honda distributors and supplied Andrew with a CR250 in 1975 and a CR125 in 1976. In 1975, his first year as a senior rider, Andrew won the Queensland 250cc short circuit title, the 250cc 3-hour short circuit race class at Maryborough, and won many motocross races around Queensland, with George mentoring and swinging the spanners. In 1976, Andrew was second to Steve Kramer in the Sunshine State Motocross Series after 6 rounds of intense battles at Tivoli near Ipswich, Queensland. That year, he was also the runner-up Australian 125cc motocross champion, finishing a close second to Steve Kramer after some exciting duels in the 2 30-minute motos at Tivoli in Ipswich on the 29th of August. Then a couple of weeks later, he was runner-up to Peter Boyle in Rockhampton in the Queensland motocross titles. After moving to Brisbane at the start of 1977 and completing his apprenticeship with Don Newell Motorcycles Brisbane, Andrew won the Queensland 500cc championship and was runner-up in the Unlimited title. This earned him the prestigious #1 plate for Queensland for the 1978 season, riding Yamahas that year for Queensland distributor Anand and Thompson. Andrew went professional the following year and rode Yamahas through to 1981. He won the Queensland Unlimited motocross title in 1980 and was the runner-up Australian champion at Dargle in New South Wales in both the 500cc and Unlimited classes. Andrew went to America at the end of 1980 to compete in the Californian Golden State Series, but unfortunately he dislocated both his ankles at his first practice session and continued to have problems with his ankles for the entire series. Coming back to Australia, he injured himself at the Sydney Supercross and was out for the year. Then in 1982, and back on a bike, he went over the bars with the bike landing on top of him. After these 2 bad accidents, one which almost paralysed him, and the loss of a very good friend in a racing incident, Andrew re-evaluated his racing career. He decided to call an end to the sport that he had competed in since a child to focus on his business career. Andrew established a motocross training school and was offered a partnership in the Queensland division of Farm Life, a motorcycle accessories company which is now known as Steve Kramer Products. This Queensland branch of the company is now Pro Accessories Australia and is owned by Andrew and his business partner Greg Parker, which they still run today from Coopers Plains in Queensland. After retiring from scrambles and before the move to Queensland, George Bailey took up TQ car racing at the local speedway. He used the Triumph motor from his racing bike and finished up winning a TQ championship with that motor as well. Although busy on the farm, when Andrew relocated to Brisbane for his motocross career, George went to all the motocross events he could get to support him. George loved fishing and boating, selling some of his championship machines to fund his new interests, like the 20-foot V8 cabin cruiser that he purchased for family enjoyment and holidays. When the first World Motocross of Nations came to Australia in 1992, George, Glad, Robin, Andrew, David Armstrong and other motocross riders went to Manjimup in Western Australia to watch this historic event. In 1996, Glad and George also started to travel, driving completely around Australia that year. In 2016, George's eldest son Robin decided to restore his famous Matchless 500 back to its original condition. Robin was around 12 years of age when he first became aware of George's bike that won the 1956 Australian All Powers Championship and more than 5 state titles in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. After retiring from racing, George lent the bike to a friend to ride, and its whereabouts were lost until the mid-60s when another friend turned up at Bailey Motors with an update. Robin will never forget the experience when he first heard the engine, felt the vibrations and smelled the fuel when George fired up the Matchless at the Kawana family farm where he grew up in Langwarrin. From then on, Robin was also hooked on motorbikes and developed a strong bond with the Matchless, spending many hours servicing, maintaining and riding it. Despite its vintage, Robin rode the bike at club events and even at the Southeast Suburban Centre Club Championships at Narre Warren before graduating to his mother Glad's Yamaha 125 trail bike for club days and his first open event at Pearcedale in 1970. The Matchless was then left in the shed unridden, gathering dust until Robin took it to Queensland when he moved there in 1979. The next time it was fired up was in the late 80s when Robin's sons Jay and Ryan were about 4 and 6 respectively. The engine backfired, ejecting large flames from the exhaust, and the boys took off like rabbits with fright, from that moment on referring to it as the Dragon Bike. After many years, in 2015, Robin decided to restore the Matchless 500 back to its original glory, using as much of the original bike as possible. Here's a summary of its history and key features when it was a standard street bike, then later modified by George for scrambles racing. The 1953 500 Matchless originally belonged to one of George's mates, Alan Gray, who worked for him as an RACV response and tow truck driver. George bought it from him to race, with Ravenswood being one of its first outings in 1954. At this event, the Matchless still had the steel guards and headlight brackets for riding on the road, but the following changes were made for racing scrambles. Knobby tyres replaced the road tyres. A 23-inch front wheel replaced the standard 19-inch wheel. The suspension travel was around 75 to 100 millimetres front and rear, standard for the time. A straight-out exhaust was used without a muffler. A new seat was fitted. The original steel guards were cut down, the engine kickstarter was removed, and extra car dampers were attached to the swinging arm to soften the track bumps, which was quite innovative at the time. George was also wearing full leathers and a Cromwell-pressed masonite helmet, which was state-of-the-art at the time. Between 1958 and 1967, further changes were made to the Matchless, but it is uncertain if George made these modifications or his friend who later raced the bike. Lighter alloy front and rear guards replaced the steel guards. A smaller BSA Bantam tank replaced the original Matchless tank. A unique oil tank was fitted, more robust racing handlebars were used, and a better, more efficient air cleaner housing was fitted. It took Robin about 6 months to restore the Matchless 500 back to its original working condition. The bike is a family treasure and heirloom and proudly displayed by Robin at his home in Gympie, Queensland. George Bailey's legacy will live on through the restored matchless 500 and 250cc Bailey Special engines. After retiring from racing, George opted for a quieter life on the farm, but he always retained his interest in motorcycles and motor repairs. He continued to ride his beloved motorbikes around the family farm into his 70s, but more sedately than in the old days. He worked until his arthritis and physical ability was such that he could no longer do so. The Bailey family were close-knit, with motocross playing a big part of their lives. When George passed away on the 3rd of January 2007, aged 77, he had 8 grandchildren, and there are now 16 great-grandchildren who have all now heard stories of their famous grandfather. George was truly a very humble, quiet, gentle, honest person with a keen sense of fair play. He also had a great sense of humour and was very well liked by all. Had he had the financial support to travel interstate or overseas, he could have achieved much more in motocross. But he would never have left his family to do this. He really only raced for the fun. George was an outstanding competitor, mechanic and engine designer, way ahead of his time, and he will go down in history as Australia's first true Australian motocross champion.